Okay, hello and welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about motivation and contract theory, but really what this is going to be all about is following up with our discussion of asymmetric information. And in a previous video, I discussed Akerlof's market for lemons application through variant, thinking about adverse selection in markets when buyers can't observe good or bad quality for whatever they're buying. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the opposite problem, which is the problem of moral hazard, where, for instance, you have some principal that has some interest that you'd like the agent to be able to follow through on, maybe an employer that would like an employee to work hard, and you have this problem where the employee might shirk. So the problem of moral hazard, it's a problem that happens after the transaction, where the agent fails to take adequate precaution, maybe operates or acts opportunistically. This is like if you have car insurance and then you take more risks driving on snowy roads than you wouldn't have ordinarily, or if you have coverage from AAA or something, you're not as worried about going in the ditch because maybe you believe somebody's going to come and bail you out, and you can think of like the parallels with the financial crisis and so on and so forth. So moral hazard is a problem that happens after the transaction where the decision maker fails to take adequate precaution or behaves opportunistically. And now I'm thinking about, well, how can we motivate employees to work hard? How can we avoid the moral hazard problem? And so we'll think about this through an incentive contract and then through monitoring. So there's some different types of forms of compensation you can think of for motivating employees. I actually won't talk about all these, but basic idea is you could think of like a standard salary. The problem here is that this is definitely going to be subject to moral hazard because your output is invariant to your working decision. There's incentive pay. This is going to be less subject to moral hazard, perhaps not at all subject to moral hazard, if you're able to fully incentivize the worker. And so that's what I'll discuss in this lecture. Yeah, you can talk about bonuses or stock options, other types of perks and benefits. Stock options is one way to try to align upper management's incentives with the shareholders, and in a way that is particularly useful if there's not some easily observable output that could be incentivized. This would be like sort of looking at aligning your behavior such that it improves the fortunes of the organization as a whole, when there might be a lot of different things that makes that happen. And so that's sort of another way to overcome incentive problems, hopefully. All right, so some things to think about if we're deciding employee compensation. The first thing is, well, is it easy to monitor the employee's performance, and how are they going to respond from you doing that? Because there's some morale issues in terms of consumer or workers not being necessarily pleased to be observed and monitored. There's a question about, is it possible to incentivize the worker to work hard by trying to avoid moral hazard by maybe giving them the full returns of their efforts? And we'll talk about that in this lecture. There's a problem, though, about the compensation risk for employees, because if you have this, if you have a full incentive contract, this can open up the employee to bearing a lot of risk in case there's a negative economic shock, such as, all of a sudden, if you're a salesperson and you're trying to sell cars and there's a coronavirus, you're not selling nearly as many cars as you would have been before, even though it's through no fault of your own, or if there's other type of like recession or something like that. You think of the problem of multitasking. This isn't the way we usually think about multitasking. Usually we think of multitasking of like you're doing a number of different things at the same time. That's part of what's happening here, but the problem with multitasking in our sense of like incentivizing workers is, suppose you have multiple things that fall under your job description, some of which can be monitored and then incentivized, others that can't be, that are still important. And there might be tax issues that we think about with compensation. That's not really my area. All right, so the problem with moral hazard. It is typically very difficult or costly for the employer to ensure that the employee is working hard. I used to work in an amusement park in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and we got paid like $5.61 an hour up to like $7 something an hour, and you got paid the same amount no matter how many people would come on your ride. And I would work in the kiddie land operating kiddie rides, so there'd be like Jeeps and boats the little kids would go on. And the thing is, little kids will have dinner time and then have bedtime relatively early at night. The shift would go until 9, but I would notice the children would kind of leave for dinner around like 6 or so. And so if we made the rides look as though nobody was there, then if a family came by and you're kind of hiding behind the ride, maybe they think you're doing some type of maintenance, they might not come. And so before long, you would end up having not many people bothering to go back into this relatively distant, I know it was maybe like a couple hundred feet extra, portion of the amusement park. And if you did that long enough, you could actually make a circumstance where after about 6:30, after about 7 or 8 o'clock, you could sit there and read. I was teaching myself linear algebra from Gilbert Strang's videos from MIT back in 2002. And so like there's a lot of interesting things you're able to do. That's not what the amusement park wanted us to be doing, right? They wanted us to be working hard. The problem is I get paid the same whether I'm studying linear algebra or operating the ride. And if there's no customers, I can't operate the ride. Well, this is exactly moral hazard, right? This is the problem. Employees might not work as hard as their employees want them to do, right? The idea, well, the employees feel the cost of their effort, but they do not necessarily receive the gains of this effort. As a result, they underprovide. This is shirking. The problem is the amusement park would gain from each ticket, from each rider that I would tear, and they'd have to go purchase a new ticket for another ride. However, I didn't get that benefit. I only had the cost of getting up and sitting down, which could be pretty annoying if you had just like a couple families going around, and so you get sporadically sitting up and sitting down, and just kind of like that's the worst if you're operating a ride. And if there's a steady stream of customers, that's good, because then you get up, run the ride, sit back down. But if there's only a couple, then it's this really sporadic thing that's, I don't know, I'd rather just kind of zone out or do my own thing or study or whatever. But anyway, so here's a model we can think of this situation. Suppose we have hired an employee to work for us as a salesperson. We'll think of E as being the employee's chosen level of effort. We'll think of S as being the total sales. So it's going to be E. Oh, shoot. I mean for this to be the same E. I mean for this to be an epsilon E. Anyway, this is effort plus theta. So in thousands, I mean for these to be the same. I'm not going to fix that. I was completely inconsistent. Anyway. So total sales are going to be a sum of the worker's chosen level of effort and then some exogenous factor, some shock. So it could be like other like fluctuations in the environment, could be seasonality, whatever. So you think of some random factor that affects the sales of the product, and suppose this has mean zero. On average, theta is going to be zero. Then we'll assume there's a psychic cost to the employee for exerting this effort. So the psychic cost, the effort cost, the cost of effort is going to be 10,000 times this nice polynomial, this nice quadratic, right? Okay. Suppose we have an employment contract. So the wage, we'll just call it wage just to represent compensation, is going to have a fixed component and then going to have a variable component. So it's going to be S is the number of sales, and then B is the incremental value of one additional sale. So there's a fixed part of the compensation, that was part A, and then there's a part that depends on the sales, that's the B times S, that's our incentive pay. The incentive pay depends on sales because the employer doesn't directly observe the effort, only the resulting level of sales. Okay, so the employee will assume they have a utility function, so their utility is going to be whatever is their wage minus their psychic effort cost. And we'll assume the employee is going to work for us only if they expect that their wage is going to be at least $50,000, right? We'll call this their reservation wage or their reservation utility. Our profit function are going to be 100,000 times S and then minus W. I don't know, maybe we're selling high-end cars or something like that. When I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon, I'd drive north out of town, and I'd get buzzed by this green car that I later identified as a Lotus. There's a Lotus dealer, which is a British car maker that was north, not quite to Wexford or Cranberry. And so I'd see this car. I don't know if it was the dealership or test drives, and I always wanted to test drive one of those things, but they are pricey, so kind of out of my budget and further than I'd be more expensive than I would be comfortable test driving. Let's say that. So as an owner, your profit is $100,000 per unit of S minus the compensation paid to the employee. All right, so first consider a contract that involves the incentive pay being zero. So this would be a pure fixed wage contract. Where's that coming from? Remember, our wage was fixed component A plus the incentive pay. So if B is zero, then it doesn't matter how many sales you make, you're only paid A. Right? That's the idea. So in such a contract, the employee gets paid the same amount, wage is equal to A, regardless of how many sales they make. All right, so what effort will the employee put forth under this contract? Well, let's get their utility function. The employee is going to try to maximize their utility. So it's going to be A, which is their wage, plus, well, this is going to go to zero, minus the psychic cost of effort. This is going to be just A minus 10,000 times that nice quadratic. We'll take a derivative with respect to effort, right? They're choosing their optimal level of effort. So we're going to differentiate with respect to effort. And then solving, sure enough, we're going to get an effort level of 1. And so the observation, this does not depend on the level of A, right? The yearly fixed wage that you're paying the employee, they're not getting, it doesn't matter how many additional sales they're making, they're still earning just whatever is that A. So this is their effort when they're not receiving the benefits of their working. All right, so to determine the value of A now, we have to determine what this is going to be. We should pay our employee just enough to make them willing to work for us. So suppose we remember their reservation wage was $50,000, so we need their utility after bearing their psychic cost of effort for 1 unit of effort has to be at least $50,000. So I'm going to set 50,000 has to be equal to A minus 10,000 times, well, let's evaluate this at 1. Right? Because we found the optimal level of effort they'd be selling or they'd be working at would be 1. If we do this, well, we end up getting A minus 10,000 times 1. And so what does it tell us? Well, the utility needs to be, we need to set A, the utility is going to be 50,000. So we need to set A at 60,000 such that 60,000 minus 10,000 gives them a utility of 50,000 for working for us, which matches their reservation utility. All right. And as a result, that consumer is going to be indifferent between working for us and not. If we set the wage of exactly the fixed component of exactly 60,000. What are our expected profits? Well, it's going to be the 100,000 times the number of sales. Well, sales is going to be effort plus, in this case, 0, because we're expecting mean 0 for theta. So it's going to just be 100,000 minus 60,000 that we're paying them for their fixed component of their wage. So our profits are 40,000. Okay, good. Now let's see if we can do better. Suppose we set both the fixed component and the variable component to maximize profits. And the question is, well, what should we set B as? Well, let's try to fully incentivize their hard work, right? Remember the wage is equal to fixed component plus the variable component. What if we determine how much our profit change when they make an additional sale and we give them exactly that amount? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at our profit function and I'm going to determine how much my profits increase by an additional sale. I can actually go back to just right here. Profits when sale rises by 1, or just differentiate profit, take d pi ds. It's going to be 100,000. We should set B is equal to 100,000. All right. So that's this right there. My profits increase by 100,000 for each additional unit of effort, each additional sale. So this entails setting B equal to 100,000 to fully incentivize our worker. All right, so if we fully incentivize our worker, if B is equal to 100,000, how much effort does the employee actually put in? Well, again, we'll go to the utility function. It's going to be A plus 100,000 times B minus their psychic effort cost. So A, we don't know what that is yet. We'll find that. 100,000 times epsilon plus theta, and we're assuming theta is mean 0, so that'll drop out to just be 0. And then minus this 10,000 times that nice quadratic that was governing our psychic effort cost of effort. We'll still take our first order condition. This is going to be the utility function as utility is a function of effort. So we'll take du d epsilon or du de, depending on which version of this you want to read. And either way, our first order condition is going to be 100,000 minus 10,000 times, well, this 2 epsilon minus 2 is equal to 0 makes it our first order condition. And solving through, we find our effort level is actually going to be 6. Right? When we give them the full returns to their effort, they set an effort level of 6, which is great. Right? So they're working a lot harder. Why? Because they get 100,000 for each sale. Okay, good. Given that B is equal to 100,000 and epsilon is equal to 6, what do we need to set their fixed wage at to get the employee to exert or to expect their reservation utility of 50,000? Remember, we don't need to give them the full we need their total compensation when they walk away at the end of the day to be equal to 50,000 to make them willing to work for us rather than just accepting the reservation wage. So I'll set U is equal to 50,000 and then I'll solve. All right, we need to find what A is going to be. This is 100,000. We found this is 6. This is going to be evaluating at 6. Oh no, I've got this as 62. This is definitely not 62, is it? This is 6 to the second power. Right? So this should be 6 squared. This should be 36, if anything, right? So this should be 6 to the second power. This is a LaTeX error. So I need to have caret, curly bracket 2, and I didn't have that there. So this should be 6 squared. So I don't know. Maybe I should write that. So I always worry about, like, suppose Suppose somebody sees this. This should be 6 to the second minus 2 times 6 plus 2 is what we actually want here. So I don't know, that's terrible. All right, there we go. And then we have u is equal to a plus 340,000 is what this evaluates to. And solving, we find a, the fixed component, has to be negative $290,000 to give the employee ultimately, at the end of the day, $50,000 worth in utility. And if the worker is going to pay us $290,000 a year for the privilege of working here and then receiving $100,000 for each additional unit sold, their utility they walk away from matches their reservation utility, and they're exactly indifferent between working for us and not at this contract, which seems a little bit unusual. This employment contract specifies B is going to be $100,000, but the fixed component is $290,000. So the employee is paying us $290,000 to work for us, and then we give them $100,000 for every sale that they generate. This doesn't seem to make sense, but it does. Think about the car dealership example and think about how much value the car dealer, the car salesperson is contributing. Or think about like mall kiosk workers. We're sitting at a kiosk waiting for sales, right? You can't have a car dealership without having people selling cars, right? That person has to be there running and offering test drives and talking to consumers, whether or not there's going to be any sales, right? There has to be a salesperson there, and they're contributing implicitly quite a lot of value to the car dealership, even if they don't make a sale, right? Think about the value that employee, if they're on commission basis, is contributing to the car dealership when they make no sale. They're still contributing a lot of value being there. I mean, the service department, you can't have the car dealership without having the salespersons there, right? And so the idea is not literally the workers writing a check for $290,000. That'd be ridiculous. It's that implicitly they're contributing that amount of value to the firm. All right, so what are our expected profits? Well, it's going to be the $290,000. We don't even need to do the calculation to figure that out, right? We're paying them for each additional sale. We are giving them our incremental revenue out as part of our labor cost. And so the per unit profit for the firm is going to be zero. The firm is only profiting from this fixed component that the worker is giving back to them. In some sense, this has a very same flavor as the two-part tariff lecture that I did a couple videos ago, right? Where here the profits aren't coming from per unit profits, it's coming from the fixed component. Here's the calculation. I said we didn't need to do the calculation. Suppose we do it. You'd want to do this if this is an exam question. You'd actually want to do it. So here's 100,000 times the 6 plus 0, and then minus the wage. So the wage is going to be minus 290,000 minus the 100,000 times the 6. All right, this ends up giving us $290,000 in profits. If you actually trace through here, this $600,000 cancels off with this $600,000, and this becomes a plus as the $290,000. So we could actually skip this line that I've bolded. It's actually just the way to think about this is $600,000. This is the revenue. This is marginal cost. Let's subtract revenue and cost, and then this right here is the fixed cost, the fixed revenue, which becomes $290,000. And you'll see that in the write-up for the IMX exercises that I've got. Turns out, I won't prove this explicitly, but this is indeed the profit-maximizing employment contract for the simple model, right? In these simple models, profit-maximizing employment contract gives the employee the full return of their effort. They maximize this, reduces the incidence of moral hazard, and this is a brilliant way to fully incentivize the worker. This is exactly my example. So suppose you're thinking of like where this would happen. I gave you the example of commission. Suppose you own a car dealership. Your profits over dealer invoice is $20,000. To maximize profits, give the salesperson exactly the $20,000 on each car sold. Question is, where do profits come from here? Well, at the dealer level, profits come from a couple places in the car model. One is like service center, and so the service center is sort of a profit center for the car dealership, and also the brand, the manufacturer itself will have some component that they'll subsidize or they'll pay to the individual dealer for selling each unit and to the salesperson themselves. All right, so even though this is profit maximizing, there's some problems. What if there's risk? And so we'll explore this next numerically. Then I'll talk about multitasking and information in a second. So the first thing, a full return contract adds a great deal of risk to the employee's total compensation. They might not like this risk. That's exactly my example. Suppose you're a car salesperson or you're sitting at a mall kiosk and nobody comes, and you're there all summer and nobody comes. What ends up happening? Well, you've invested a lot of your time. You've incurred this massive opportunity cost of your own labor time and not made any sales. So if you're 100% commission based, that's a lot of risk to bear. So in the above example, we ignored randomness in sales. We said sales is equal to epsilon plus theta, and we said theta's on average means 0. What if there's some variance, right? What if there's a normal distribution? What if some years it's positive 4, other years it's negative 4? Suppose in the year in question, it's negative 4. That's a problem because the employee's compensation in this year, well, their wage is going to be this fixed component. They're giving up $290,000 worth of their time. We're going to pay them $100,000 for every sale they make. How many sales did they make? Well, their effort was 6. Their theta was -4, so they're only going to make 2 sales, which means they're going to walk away with minus $90,000. That's a problem. It's a big problem. And while it's the case that this could go in the employee's favor, maybe there's going to be a year where theta takes a high realization. The problem is this sort of fluctuation and this instability is completely untenable for a worker. It's very difficult to get somebody to accept 100% commission based, because what if there's a coronavirus and you can't make any sales, right? What if you have a mortgage to pay and you're not bringing in anything? You're not bringing anything in. The more standard model for car dealers is that they'll give some base salary. So it might be $20,000, $30,000, $36,000, $40,000 a year. And if you don't make any sales, that's what you get. Now, if you don't make any sales, you're not going to be working there any further. However, this does provide some insurance for the worker to make them more amenable to the particular contract. Ultimately, yeah, we might not want to use the full incentive contract. We might want to set some lower B and some higher A. Because there's a trade-off between incentives and risks here, meaning we might not want to pay them the full returns for making additional sale, nor maybe we give them some fixed component, such as the $36,000 that I suggested as like a base salary for your car dealer. And the idea is this reduces some of the risk that the employee is bearing and makes it more likely that they'll accept the contract in the first place. There's this trade-off between incentives and risk. And notice, going back to two-part tariff, this is also a little bit like reducing the fixed access fee and raising the per unit fee to the optimal level. And there's kind of a parallel between those two types of exercises, especially if you'd have employees with different types of employees. So the two-part tariff that I was referencing was for the heterogeneous demanders case. All right, so now let me talk about multitasking. One issue is that very often employees are going to perform multiple tasks. So for instance, sales and customer satisfaction is really important, especially customer satisfaction is necessary for repeat purchases and for going to the service department. Production and quality control is important, but if we're only paying people for the number of widgets they make and not how many are high quality, there's a problem. So the problem with full incentive contracts is, what if only one of the tasks is fully compensated and the other isn't? Now the employee might underprovide the other task that's also important. They might try to maximize sales but not follow up to ensure customer satisfaction. And so that's a problem, because overall this might lead to diminished profitability. So problems would be ignoring customer satisfaction to boost sales, ignoring quality to increase quantity. If you have a vineyard, cutting the vines too short to boost current grape production is bad for the long run profitability of the vineyard. This is also an argument against relating funding and teacher pay to standardized test results. You might get overemphasis on those standardized test results and underemphasis on the critical thinking and the sort of more important aspects to the development of the student's mind, apart from the test score, right? So there's other things that are really important. Proxying salary on sales and quantity and great production and standardized test scores is only going to be long run beneficial if those things you're conditioning payment on are strongly correlated with these other things, and they very well might not be. So all these things suggest a reason to use something less than the full incentive contract. Also, other problems with using the full incentive contract is though it can ultimately get rid of moral hazards. Suppose at the amusement park, I was paid per unit, per ticket that I tore. You better believe I'd try to get a lot more riders on my ride, because if I could turn in more tickets at the end of the day and have a higher salary or higher hourly, maybe it counted to boost my hourly wage, I would definitely have worked a lot harder. The problem is it's not always the case that there's some obvious output to base your incentive contract on. Maybe there's not like sales or tickets or something like that. And that's especially the case for administration or for managerial type jobs. So one alternative here is to use stock options or employee ownership as where the output would be the value of the business as a whole. And the idea here would be presumably the things we want this worker, this manager to be doing are strongly correlated with the things that are going to be rewarding the organization as a whole. And so if they're interested in boosting their compensation by virtue of making stock prices rise, they're probably going to take the actions that are going to be good for the organization. Though obviously there's kind of a key incentive problem, and there's horror stories about CEOs trying to maximize the current stock price and then selling off their shares as soon as they leave the company, and then having this much to the detriment of the company as a whole. All right, so the problem or the benefit, well, employees would have incentives to put an effort here because they'd see some return in the stock prices. Another issue is that this might not fully take care of the situation. Still doesn't provide full incentives. Here's an example. Suppose your manager owns 20% of the firm. The manager has an option to incur some private, possibly partially psychological cost of $30,000. Should they do it? Well, suppose it increases the value to the firm by $100,000. That's good because this would end up being really good for the firm as a whole, but will they actually do it? Well, suppose this is going to increase their well-being by $20,000. Wait a second, I just incurred a $30,000 psychological cost, or $30,000 maybe working overtime or working on some extra project on the weekends. And it's only going to net me it's only going to bring me $20,000, and as a result, I'm going to be $10,000 worse off than I would have been before. Will I do it? No, absolutely not. So there can be problems in terms of incentivizing the manager with stock options. However, these incentives can help and are used in a lot of different situations. There can be probably less of a multitasking problem here too, because probably more of the things that are part of the job description are correlated with increasing value to the firm, but there can be other types of incentive problems. Last thing that we can say is, well, an alternative to providing explicit incentive contracts would be to monitor your employees. Maybe use possibility of bonuses or the threat of losing the job to ensure hard work. So to the extent that monitoring is resulting in higher pay and reward could be correlated with the idea of efficiency wages. So efficiency wages would be the situation where the firm is paying higher than equilibrium wages with the goal of trying to raise the opportunity cost, raise the cost of becoming unemployed, right? So thinking about the threat of losing your job, well, the threat of losing your job becomes substantially worse if your current employer is paying you more than you could find anywhere else, right? So the efficiency wage is an above equilibrium wage, and this can induce hard work if there's a future, if you want to stay with that company into the future and continue to earn that higher wage than you could earn anywhere else. And so this is one of the reasons why you'll see firms voluntarily raising their internal minimum wage over the past couple of years. And so like from 2014, 2015, Walmart was raising their internal minimum wage. Why? Well, one of the problems with companies like this is turnover. And so they want to incentivize and try to raise the penalty for leaving the firm by virtue of sweetening the deal for staying. And if the wage that you're earning with your current employer is higher than you could get elsewhere, you have less of a reason to try to switch jobs. And so that's the idea, and that's the argument with efficiency wages. All right, so thinking about some key issues in determining employee compensation, well, we want to pay attention to how easy it is to monitor the workers' effort levels. If it's easy to monitor effort, maybe use some type of monitoring and use some type of efficiency wage payment scheme. Is there a well-defined output? If so, you might be able to eradicate or eliminate moral hazard by giving the full incentive contract. If the worker is not going to be amenable to that, maybe you give them something less than the full employment contract, but still something that's going to incentivize hard work and hopefully over overcome moral hazard, overcome shirking. The problem then, consideration is risk versus the incentives. That's a trade-off between who's bearing the risk, the employer or the employee. And if the employee is not willing to bear the risk of going through a year with no sales, you might need something less than the full commission-based salary to make them interested in taking that job. And then the other consideration is, are there multiple tasks that are important? And what happens if you're only defining salary or only conditioning salary over one particular output, but we want them to do multiple things? That's one of the issues to think about when it comes to multitasking and trying to overcome the other incentive problems that can happen if people try to overcommit to whatever it is that's raising their compensation most directly. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I hope you liked the video, and then I will see you next time.